not quite sure where to start and where to finish. Well, you'll tell me when to finish. I put a great deal of thought and effort into preparing this commentary, and I chose to play with as straight a bat as possible, and it seemed to me that I could assist you all most helpfully by looking at the factors that you were obliged to take into account from the Local Government Commission determination, by the law as it's interpreted by the guidelines, and lay those factors out as questions and pose them of the proposal that you've come up with. So I advocate not for 14 or 16 or for 19. That's not the role I see in this piece of work. It's to see how each of those would deliver on the questions that you are required to take account of. So the questions arise, as you know, from the determination that required you to consider a citywide arrangement, was a particular point in the determination, to consider the strength of commonality between the community wards out on the peninsula, and to look at the peninsula ward as it is now, because the Commission said that that is not an enduring solution. Now, why they said that, who knows, and whether it might be contested again by you, that would be your decision. I'd make the observation, however, that between the time of the determination and now, that the Local Electoral Act was amended to include a further reason why a council might hold a community with lower representation. So the criteria on which the local government decision made that determination has changed, and you now have a further reason, should you choose to use it, for leaving Banks Peninsula or some other part of the city with a variation from the plus or minus 10% rule. And that new reason that's emerged is that if by striving to achieve a number in the ward closer to the 10% variation, that if that required you to put together communities with little commonality, then you could decide not to. The Local Electoral Act and the guidelines that fall from it give strong guidance to you on the importance of communities of interest and defining those community of interest before you do anything further in your work. And clearly the work that the staff did with the subcommittee did that very well. There's no question that that was the foundation of your work, and that's a huge tick and something that you should all feel pleased and proud about, particularly the staff. The effective representation is the toughie, and it's hard in every respect because you've got to balance communities of interest. What is a boundary to a community? When you have to combine communities, as inevitably is the case, what are the factors of commonality that you can lean on to take that decision? And then the third one, fair representation, that's the numbers game that I've already mentioned a variation for as possible. So based on those factors, I drew 14 questions, and they are in the report and summarised in the executive summary for easy reference. And so the first one, do the proposals reflect the direction given through pre-consultation? Well, the answer I conclude is yes. although perhaps when the final cuts were made to get the boundaries to fit the numbers, some of that point may have been lost. Did the review process and its results represent a comprehensive review of citywide arrangements? This was a directive from the Local Government Commission, and the answer is a resounding yes. Have the strengths of commonality between Lintorol Mount Herbert community and the Akaraa Wairera community been examined? The answer is yes. Are the communities of interest given prominence in the proposed boundaries, and were they addressed early in the process? As I've mentioned earlier, that started off yes, but may have been lost a little when the hard decisions had to be taken about the numbers. Have changes in communities of interest over time been acknowledged and reflected in the proposal? Yes and no, and I think that's probably a tick for you. It's not easy to do them all. We faced quite a number of changes post-earthquake, obviously. You've decided to put all the red areas on the margins of the red zone in a single ward, so that's recognising a commonality of interest. Equally, you could have used the red zone as a boundary, which would have been another reflection on the changes. There have been some changes in relationships between suburbs that emerged. I gave one illustration of the Heathcote and the Littleton community came much closer together following the earthquakes. Littleton lost its pubs, and Heathcote, it may seem trivial, but they lost their dairy. It meant that they were faced with a 15 to 20 minute drive to get the milk and the bread, and that re-established has been changed. Heathcote hasn't got a dairy back, so it still tends to use the port, but the port, of course, was quickly to get its pubs back, as you'd imagine it would.
Priorities.
Do the proposed wards and community boundaries create barriers to participation? This is a critical element in the Local Electoral Act and the guidance, and this is the first one of several from here on in where the proposed Banks Peninsula Sumner ward is quite problematic. It's going to be very difficult for a councillor working that ward, and it's going to be quite hard for some of the people in the different distal parts of the community to work together, to come together physically. Do the proposed boundaries split communities of interest? There are many small splits. There are quite a number in the 16 ward proposal. There's quite a number in the 14 ward proposal, contrary to an earlier submission. There are fewer in the 19 ward proposal. And the logic of that is just that the more wards you have, the more chances you have of being able to circumscribe a smaller community. So the 19 will always win out on communities of interest. I've addressed in particular three of the major splits in the 16. That's in the Woolston area, where there's and the Aranui area. But there are a number of other small splits, and I can answer those particular questions if people are unaware of them, but I'll leave that till question time. All of them, I believe, can be rectified with small changes at the margins of the proposed wards, and I'm happy to continue to work with staff if council seeks that to help them with that. Do the proposed boundaries comply with the plus or minus 10% requirements of the Act? They do, but some are pretty close to the upper limit, and if these are census day population data, then it's possible as a result of post-census change population movement that they might be close to or over the top. I don't think the Local Government Commission will hold you to ransom on that, but they're on record of chiding one council gently for not taking sufficient account of the post-census numbers. I believe staff are on top of that. Where communities of interest are combined, are they similar in character? The answer's pretty well yes, except we've got the Banks Peninsula Sumner problem starting to emerge again. I've observed here that in reflecting on the direction from the Local Government Commission determination around the to look at the Banks Peninsula Ward, that you may have missed the opportunity of looking for some intermediate position between the very large extent to which that population is under quota, to now trying to find a solution where it is exactly in quota. There may be some middle position that would both suit or meet the Local Government Commission's concern and may better help you with fair and effective representation.
Have you got an idea of what that could look like? We had a discussion beforehand, which was in a public session, but looking at the relationship between Heathcote, for example, and Littleton.
Heathcote, well, it's a problem.
Yeah.
There's no doubt it's a problem.
But the advice you're giving is that we could actually consider the option of leaving Akaroa, leaving Banks Peninsula as a separate ward in its own right, and then redoing the numbers across the city.
I'm suggesting that you should look at that.
Or there might be a middle ground.
Look at that closely.
Yeah.
Okay. So that
you would look more at that than look for a middle ground. Maybe a middle ground for a fallback position.
Well, I'll leave the recommendation on the table that you ask staff to prepare a set of maps in which the Banks Peninsula Ward, as it is currently, is married with Sumner and with Heathcote Valley, and do the calculations as whether that brings you to a variation from the 10% that is not as excessive as the present one is.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's arguable.
Yeah, I think that you weren't here when we had the discussion, so the discussion sort of went along the lines of, have we in fact taken a view on the direction or the guidance from the Local Government Commission's previous decision too literally, and in a post-disaster environment with many changes yet to come, perhaps it is something that we need to review, and we're getting advice from our advisor that that's something that we could legitimately do.
Good. I think that would be very effective.
Thank you.
Do the ward arrangements avoid barriers to participation? They do, once again, with the exception of Banks Peninsula Sumner. It's going to be very hard for some of those communities to participate in ward-based activities with their councillor or with their fellow citizens. Are the wards small enough to enable reasonable access to the council representative and vice versa? I would hate to have the travel to be driving if I was the councillor for Banks Peninsula Sumner. They'd spend all their time driving. Do the community boards arrangements group communities of similar character? Yes, for the most part. It's hard to argue on the basis of common interest and commonality that the Woolston Ward and the Cashmere Ward, for instance, be in the same community board. It's not a very good match. Do the community board arrangements enable access by constituents to their elected representatives? The answer is yes. Has the exception to the 10% been considered for Banks Peninsula and arguments been put forward against us? Well, we've just canvassed that in response to your questions and comments, Madam Mayor. So I'll leave my summary as brief as it is with that and happily answer questions around the general points or some specifics around the split communities, should there be any.
We're just at time though, so I'm sort of determined that
I think I had 25 minutes. I had a larger block of time.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, they didn't start the clock right then. Hey? Oh, okay. All right. So we won't stop for a morning tea break then. Phil.
Thanks, Martin. One of the comments you've made around communities of interest being given sufficient prominence, I think you made the comment that although that was a focus of the pre-consultation part, that in fact when we as a council had discussed that, we hadn't perhaps considered that sufficiently as a priority. Is there a way now, like for example, looking at the boundaries of the maps, that in fact you think that as a council we can in fact address that so that we do give it more prominence?
If I conveyed that impression, I was a little harsh. I was suggesting that perhaps when the staff tried to sort of square the circle around the numbers, then that had to take a lower priority rather than saying you as councillors didn't take it. But in answer to your question, yes, it is possible. I think there are marginal adjustments that can be made to improve the community of interest situation.
Yep. Thanks, Martin.
Yep. Raf.
Yeah. Hi, Martin. Just a quick question since you're here. What do you think of the anomaly that the general electorate wards are different to the local election wards, and is this an opportunity to match those up, or does that not make sense?
Well, it's not necessarily an anomaly that they don't follow it. The electoral, when you're setting general electorate boundaries, you're required to reflect on the local body of boundaries, but there's no reciprocal requirement on the local body boundary setting to take account of general electorate boundaries.
Okay. Because there was one submission here where somebody was saying for the general election they're in Wigram and for the local body they're in Whanutun Waimari, and so in terms of their focus around representation gets split, and they've suggested that actually people can tune out a little bit when they've got to consider two different communities that they're supposed to be in around representation.
Under MMP, the general electorate boundaries are very, general electorate areas are very large, and so you're going to have that factor all over the place. Yeah, I think it's inevitable, and it's not something you can easily resolve.
Pauline.
Yeah, just for clarification, I mean, one of the problems we have or challenges is the Banks Peninsula one. So we've talked about either retaining the status quo or changing what the proposal is that goes into it. Do you have an opinion about retaining the status quo as a preference, or is it too early to say?
I've tried to stay away from having a personal preference. I've tried to set down the criteria that the factors that you're obliged to take into account by law and by the determination that gives you direction. On those bases, then, it's very hard to argue that a Banks Peninsula ward that includes this large area across the hill in Mount Pleasant is a good ward. It's very big. It's got lots of communities with different character, and it's going to be very hard to service from a representative point of view. So it doesn't meet the criteria on a number of counts.
I don't regret us going out for consultation on it, because what it's done is it's sparked off in a incredibly strong response, not on both sides of the hill. So, and I think that's incredibly helpful for us in terms of making a decision. But what I've taken from your submission, which has given me some significant comfort, is that we could actually make an adjustment. We could propose the status quo, we could propose a fallback position as well, which might be slightly different from the one that we've put out for consultation, and we would be within the framework of the questions that you've asked us to consider, and I think that's very helpful. But Andrew?
You've obviously done, Martin, a lot of work putting this report together, and it's certainly provoked some interesting discussion, and I'm sure it'll continue to do so. Given the challenges in front of us, we're going to hear what we're going to hear over the next few days, and then obviously there'll be some debate. I don't know whether you're able to speak for former Councillor Shearing as well, but are you and Bob Shearing available to assist staff with further technical information if required, based on the amount of research and work that's gone into the two papers?
I certainly can, and I think it would be appropriate if Councillor Shearing joined me, as it were, not necessarily at the same time in the same room, but also offered his advice and experience, if that was helpful.
Yep. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.